Imagine sitting in a courtroom, the air thick with tension, as a young black boy stands before a judge who seems to have already made up his mind. The boy, no more than 16, looks nervous, his hands trembling as he tries to explain his side of the story. But the judge, a man with a reputation for being harsh and unyielding, cuts him off with a sharp, dismissive tone. His words are laced with prejudice, his demeanor cold and unfeeling. It's a scene that makes your stomach churn, a moment where justice feels anything but fair. This is where our story begins, a story of prejudice, resilience, and a shocking twist that no one saw coming. The boy, let's call him Marcus, had always been a good kid. He grew up in a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone, and he was known for his quiet determination and kind heart. But life hadn't been easy for Marcus. His family struggled to make ends meet, and he often found himself in situations where he had to make tough choices. Choices that unfortunately led him to this courtroom, standing before a judge who seemed to see only the color of his skin and not the person beneath it. The judge, a man with decades of experience on the bench, had a reputation for being tough on crime, but to those who knew him well, there was something more troubling about his rulings, a pattern of bias that seemed to disproportionately affect people of color. On this particular day, as Marcus stood before him, the judge's tone was especially harsh. He interrupted Marcus repeatedly, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do you even understand the gravity of what you've done?" the judge snapped, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at the boy. Marcus tried to speak, to explain, but the judge cut him off again. "I've seen your type before," he said, his words heavy with implication. "You think you can just get away with anything, don't you?" The courtroom was silent, the tension palpable. Marcus's mother, sitting in the back, clenched her fists, her heart breaking as she watched her son being humiliated in front of everyone. She wanted to scream, to defend him, but she knew it wouldn't help. The system had already failed them so many times before. But then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, something unexpected happened. A man stood up from the audience, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Your Honor," he said, his tone calm but firm, "I think you need to hear this." The judge, clearly annoyed by the interruption, turned to the man. "And who are you?" he demanded. The man stepped forward, his eyes locked on the judge. "I'm Marcus's teacher," he said, "and I think there's something you need to know about him." The room seemed to hold its breath as the teacher began to speak, revealing a side of Marcus that the judge had never bothered to see. He talked about Marcus's dedication to his studies, his willingness to help others, and the challenges he had overcome just to be here today. But it wasn't just the teacher's words that caught everyone off guard. It was what he had brought with him. A folder filled with documents, photos, and letters that told a story the judge had never taken the time to hear. As the teacher handed the folder to the judge, the room fell silent once again. The judge hesitated, his eyes flicking between the folder and Marcus, who stood there, still trembling but with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. The judge opened the folder, his expression unreadable as he began to read. And then, something shifted. His face, once hard and unyielding, softened just a little. His eyes, once filled with disdain, seemed to waver. For the first time, he looked at Marcus not as a criminal but as a person, a young man who had made mistakes, yes, but who was also capable of so much more. But before the judge could say anything, before he could make his ruling, a commotion broke out in the back of the courtroom. A woman stood up, her face pale, her hands shaking as she pointed at the judge. "You!" she shouted, her voice trembling with emotion. "You don't get to decide his fate, not after what you've done?" The room erupted into chaos as the woman stormed forward, her accusations hanging in the air like a storm cloud. The judge, visibly shaken, tried to regain control of the courtroom, but it was too late. The truth, it seemed, was about to come crashing down, and that's where we'll leave it for now. What did the woman know about the judge? What was in the folder that made him second-guess his decision? And most importantly, what would happen to Marcus? The answers to these questions will change everything. not just for Marcus, but for everyone in that courtroom. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The courtroom, once a place of order and procedure, was now a scene of utter chaos. The woman's voice echoed off the walls, her accusation hanging in the air like a thunderclap. All eyes turned to her, a mix of shock and curiosity rippling through the room. She was middle-aged, her face lined with years of hardship, but there was a fire in her eyes that couldn't be ignored. She pointed a trembling finger at the judge, her voice cracking as she spoke. "You don't get to sit there and judge him," she said, her words sharp and deliberate. "Not after what you did to my son." The judge, usually so composed, looked visibly shaken. His face, which had moments ago been a mask of authority, now showed cracks of uncertainty. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand order, but no words came out. The bailiff stepped forward, unsure of how to handle the situation, but the woman wasn't done. She turned to the rest of the courtroom, her voice rising as she addressed the crowd. "This man," she said, gesturing to the judge, "ruined my son's life. He took everything from him, his future, his hope, his dignity. And now he's doing the same thing to this boy." She turned back to Marcus, her expression softening for just a moment. "Don't let him do it to you," she said, her voice breaking. "Fight back." The room was in an uproar. People were whispering, some shouting, others trying to make sense of what was happening. Marcus stood frozen, his mind racing. Who was this woman? What did she mean about the judge? And why was she standing up for him? He glanced at his mother, who was still seated in the back, her face a mixture of fear and hope. She gave him a small nod as if to say, "Stay strong." But Marcus couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. This was supposed to be a simple hearing, a chance to explain himself and move on. But now it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. The judge, finally regaining some composure, slammed his gavel on the bench. "Order," he barked, his voice cutting through the noise. "I will have order in this courtroom." The room quieted, but the tension was still thick. The judge turned to the woman, his eyes narrowing. "Madam," he said, his voice cold, "you are out of line. If you have a grievance, there are proper channels to address it. This is not the time or place." But the woman wasn't backing down. She took a step closer to the bench, her eyes locked on the judge. "Proper channels?" she spat. "You think I haven't tried that? You think I haven't spent years fighting to be heard? But no one listens to people like me. No one cares about the lives you destroy." Her voice was raw with emotion, and for a moment it seemed like the entire courtroom was holding its breath. Even the judge seemed at a loss for words. It was then that Marcus's teacher, who had been standing quietly to the side, stepped forward again. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I think it's important that we hear what this woman has to say. If there's any truth to her claims, it could have a significant impact on this case." The judge hesitated, his eyes flicking between the teacher, the woman, and Marcus. For a moment it seemed like he might refuse, but then he sighed and nodded. "Very well," he said, though his tone suggested he was anything but pleased. "But make it quick." The woman took a deep breath, her hands still shaking as she began to speak. 10 years ago," she said, her voice steady now, "my son was in this very courtroom. He was just a kid like Marcus here. He made a mistake, yes, but he didn't deserve what happened to him." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "This judge," she said, pointing at him again, "sentenced him to the maximum penalty, even though the evidence was shaky at best. He didn't care about the facts, he didn't care about my son's future. All he saw was another black kid who he thought deserved to be punished." The room was silent now, everyone hanging on her every word. Marcus felt a lump in his throat as he listened. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like for her son to be in his position and have everything taken away. He glanced at the judge, who was now staring down at his hands, his face unreadable. Was he feeling guilt? Or was he just waiting for this to be over? The woman continued, her voice growing stronger. "My son served his time, but when he got out, he was a different person. He couldn't find a job. couldn't get his life back on track. He fell into a deep depression, and last year, she choked back a sob, her hands clutching the edge of the bench for support. Last year, he took his own life. The room was dead silent now, the weight of her words sinking in. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a story about the past. It was a warning, a reminder of what could happen if things didn't change. The judge finally looked up, his expression a mix of anger and something else, something that almost looked like regret. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, though his tone was anything but sincere. "But this is not the time or place to air your grievances. This hearing is about the boy, not your son." The woman shook her head, her eyes blazing. "It's always about the boy, isn't it?" she said. "But what about the system that keeps failing them? What about the people in power who refuse to see them as anything more than criminals?" She turned to Marcus, her voice softening. "You have a chance to change things," she said. "Don't let them break you." Marcus didn't know what to say. He felt a mix of emotions, anger, fear, but also a strange sense of hope. This woman, a complete stranger, was standing up for him, fighting for him in a way no one else had. He looked at the judge, who was now avoiding his gaze, and then at his teacher, who gave him a small encouraging nod. He knew he had to say something, to stand up for himself, but the words wouldn't come. Before he could speak, the judge cleared his throat. "This hearing is adjourned," he said, his voice firm, but with a hint of unease. "We will reconvene tomorrow to make a final ruling." He slammed his gavel down, the sound echoing through the room, and stood up, quickly exiting through the door behind the bench. The room erupted into chatter again, but Marcus barely heard it. His mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. As he was led out of the courtroom, he caught a glimpse of the woman. She was standing by the door, her eyes still filled with tears, but with a determined set to her jaw. She met his gaze and gave him a small, sad smile. "Stay strong," she mouthed, and then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd. Marcus's mother rushed to his side, pulling him into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No matter what happens, remember that you're not alone." Marcus nodded, but his mind was still spinning. What would happen tomorrow? Would the judge change his mind, or would he double down on his prejudice? And what about the woman's accusations? Was there more to the story than anyone knew? As they left the courthouse, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The truth, whatever it was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And when it came to light, it would change everything. But for now, all he could do was wait and hope that justice, real justice, would finally be served. The night after the chaotic courtroom scene felt endless for Marcus. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment. The judge's harsh words, the woman's emotional outburst, the teacher's quiet but firm defense. Sleep wouldn't come. His mother had tried to comfort him, telling him to rest and trust that things would work out, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would change everything. He didn't know if it would be for better or worse, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let the judge define him. He had to fight not just for himself, but for everyone who had been wronged by a system that seemed stacked against them. Meanwhile, across town, the judge sat in his dimly lit study, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The events of the day had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in his own courtroom. The woman's accusations had struck a nerve, and though he tried to dismiss them as the ramblings of a grieving mother, he couldn't ignore the way her words had echoed in his mind. He thought about her son, a case he barely remembered. Had he been too harsh? Had he let his own biases cloud his judgment? He shook his head, as if to physically push the thoughts away. "I did what I had to do," he muttered to himself, though the words felt hollow. But the judge wasn't the only one haunted by the day's events. Marcus's teacher, Mr. Thompson, sat at his kitchen table, flipping through the folder he had brought to court. It was filled with letters from Marcus's classmates, test scores, and even a few photos of Marcus volunteering at a community center. Mr. Thompson had always believed in Marcus, But he knew that wasn't enough. The system was broken, and it would take more than one teacher's faith to fix it. He thought about the woman who had stood up in court, her raw pain and anger still fresh in his mind. He wondered if there was more to her story, something that could help Marcus. He made a mental note to reach out to her tomorrow. If anyone could shed light on the judge's past, it was her. The woman, whose name was Evelyn Carter, sat alone in her small apartment staring at a photo of her son Jamal. He had been just 17 when he was sentenced, his bright smile forever frozen in time. Evelyn had spent years fighting for justice, but the system had worn her down. She had almost given up until she saw Marcus in that courtroom. The look on his face, the fear in his eyes, had brought it all back. She couldn't let another young life be destroyed. She didn't know what she could do, but she knew she had to try. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. It was time to bring in someone who could help. The next morning, the courthouse was buzzing with activity. News of the previous day's drama had spread, and reporters were already gathering outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of Marcus or the judge. Marcus arrived with his mother and Mr. Thompson, their faces set with determination. They were met by a small group of supporters from the community, people who had heard about Marcus's case and wanted to show their solidarity. Marcus was overwhelmed by the show of support, but it also gave him a glimmer of hope. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he felt. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The judge took his seat, his usual stern expression in place. But there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, uncertainty perhaps, or even fear. He glanced at Marcus, then quickly looked away. Evelyn was there too, sitting in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had brought someone with her, a man in a sharp suit who introduced himself as Attorney Daniel Harris. He was a well-known civil rights lawyer, and his presence sent a clear message. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. This was about holding the system accountable. The hearing began, and the judge wasted no time in addressing the elephant in the room. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice tight, "I want to make it clear that this courtroom is a place of order and respect. Any further outbursts will not be tolerated." He glanced at Evelyn as he spoke, but she met his gaze without flinching. She wasn't going to back down, not this time. Mr. Thompson stood up, holding the folder he had brought the day before. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to submit this as evidence. It contains letters from Marcus's teachers, classmates, and community members, all of whom attest to his character and potential. I believe it's important for you to see the full picture before making your decision." The judge hesitated, then nodded for the bailiff to take the folder. He flipped through it briefly, his expression unreadable, before setting it aside. Then it was Attorney Harris's turn. He stood up, his presence commanding the room. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm but firm, "we believe there are larger issues at play here, issues of systemic bias and unequal treatment under the law. We request that this case be reviewed by an independent panel to ensure that justice is served, not just for Marcus, but for all those who have been failed by this system." The room erupted into murmurs, and the judge's face turned red with anger. "This is highly irregular," he snapped. "I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus." But before he could say more, Evelyn stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room, "this isn't about making a scene. This is about the truth. And the truth is, you have a history of rulings that disproportionately affect people of color. My son was one of them. Marcus could be next. Don't you think it's time to take a hard look at that?" The judge was silent for a long moment. His jaw clenched. He looked at Marcus, then at Evelyn, then at Attorney Harris. For the first time, he seemed unsure of what to do. The room waited, the tension so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. Finally, the judge spoke. "This hearing is adjourned," he said, his voice quieter than before. "I will take the evidence and arguments under consideration and deliver my ruling tomorrow." As the room emptied, Marcus felt a mix of emotions, relief that the hearing was over, but also anxiety about what tomorrow would bring. He looked at Evelyn, who gave him a small, encouraging smile. "You're not alone in this," she said. We're going to fight for you no matter what." Marcus nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. Outside the courthouse, the reporters swarmed, shouting questions, but Marcus kept his head down, his mother and Mr. Thompson flanking him protectively. As they walked away, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what the judge was thinking. Was he really considering the evidence, or was he just buying time? And what about Evelyn's accusations? Would they finally bring the truth to light? Or would they be swept under the rug like so many others? One thing was certain: the battle wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. And as Marcus got into the car, he made a silent promise to himself. No matter what happened, he wouldn't give up. He would fight, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been wronged by a system that had failed them. The truth was out there, and he was determined to find it, no matter the cost. The day of the judge's final ruling arrived, and the courthouse was packed. News of Marcus's case had spread like wildfire, and people from all walks of life had come to witness what many were calling a turning point. Supporters stood outside holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus and End Systemic Bias," while reporters jostled for the best angle to capture the unfolding drama. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, every seat filled, every eye fixed on the front of the room. Marcus sat between his mother and Mr. Thompson, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. He glanced at Evelyn, who gave him a reassuring nod, but even she looked tense. This was it. The moment everything would change. The judge entered the courtroom, his face unreadable as he took his seat. He didn't look at Marcus or anyone else, his eyes focused on the papers in front of him. The room fell silent, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Marcus's mother reached over and squeezed his hand, her grip tight but comforting. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "we'll get through it." Marcus nodded, but his mind was racing. What if the judge didn't change his mind? What if all of this, the support, the evidence, the fight, was for nothing? The judge cleared his throat and began to speak. After careful consideration of the evidence and arguments presented, he said, his voice steady but with a hint of something Marcus couldn't quite place, "I have decided to—" He paused, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment of truth. But before the judge could finish his sentence, the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. Everyone turned to see a man rushing in, his face flushed, a folder clutched in his hand. It was Attorney Harris, and he looked like he had run a marathon to get here. "Your Honor," he called out, his voice cutting through the silence. "I apologize for the interruption, but I have new evidence that must be presented before you make your ruling." The room erupted into murmurs, and the judge's face darkened. "This is highly irregular," he said, his voice sharp. "You had your chance to present evidence. I will not tolerate any further delays." But Attorney Harris wasn't backing down. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on the judge. "Your Honor, this evidence pertains not only to Marcus's case, but to your conduct as well. It cannot wait." The room went silent again, everyone staring at the judge, waiting for his response. He hesitated, his jaw clenched, then finally nodded. "Very well," he said, though his tone suggested he was anything but pleased. "But make it quick." Attorney Harris opened the folder and began to speak, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, we have obtained documents that show a pattern of biased rulings in your courtroom. These documents include statistics, witness testimonies, and even internal memos that suggest a deliberate targeting of individuals from marginalized communities." He paused, letting the words sink in, then continued. "But that's not all. We also have evidence that directly ties you to the wrongful conviction of Evelyn Carter's son, Jamal. Evidence that was suppressed at the time of his trial." The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting, some in support, others in outrage. Evelyn stood up, her hands trembling as she stared at the judge. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Did you know the evidence was falsified? Did you know my son was innocent?" The judge didn't answer, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the bench. Marcus felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that had been hidden for far too long. The judge finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I had no idea," he said, though the words sounded hollow. "If there was any misconduct, it was not on my part." But Attorney Harris wasn't finished. He pulled another document from the folder and held it up for everyone to see. "This," he said, "is a signed affidavit from a former court clerk who worked in this very courtroom. She claims that evidence was routinely tampered with and that you, Your Honor, were aware of it." The room was in an uproar again, the noise so loud it felt like the walls might collapse. Marcus looked at the judge, who was now visibly shaken, his usual composure completely gone. He looked like a man who had just realized the walls were closing in. Marcus's mind was spinning. What did this mean for his case? What did it mean for everyone who had been wronged by this system? And most importantly, what would happen next? The judge slammed his gavel on the bench, the sound echoing through the room. "Order," he shouted, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "I will have order in this courtroom." The noise slowly died down, but the tension was still thick. The judge took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he spoke. "Given the seriousness of these allegations," he said, his voice unsteady, "I have no choice but to recuse myself from this case. It will be reassigned to another judge, and an independent investigation will be launched into the matters raised here, today." The room erupted again, but this time it was different. There was a sense of victory, of hope, but also of uncertainty. What would happen to Marcus now? What would happen to the judge? And what about Evelyn? Would she finally get justice? For her son? Marcus looked at his mother, who was crying quietly, and at Mr. Thompson, who gave him a small, encouraging smile. They had come so far, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus felt a mix of emotions, relief, fear, but also a strange sense of determination. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been failed by the system. It was about making sure no one else had to go through what he had. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to stop fighting. Not until the truth came out. Not until justice was served. But as he walked out of the courthouse, the crowd cheering and reporters shouting questions, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still to come. The truth was out there, but it was also dangerous. And as he got into the car with his mother and Mr. Thompson, he knew one thing for sure. The fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. As Marcus and his mother drove away from the courthouse, the weight of the day's events hung heavy in the air. The streets were buzzing with activity, people talking animatedly about what had just unfolded. Marcus stared out the window, his mind racing. The judge's recusal felt like a victory, but it also opened the door to 1,000 new questions. Who would take over the case? Would the new judge be fair? And what about the investigation into the old judge's conduct? Would it really lead to justice, or would it be swept under the rug like so many other scandals? Mr. Thompson, who had followed them in his own car, pulled up beside them at a red light. He rolled down his window and gave Marcus a thumbs up, his face filled with a mix of relief and determination. Marcus managed a small smile in return, but his stomach was in knots. Something didn't feel right. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. When they got home, Marcus's mother insisted on making tea, her way of calming her nerves. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around the warm mug, but he couldn't bring himself to take a sip. His mind kept going back to the courtroom, to the look on the judge's face when Attorney Harris presented that affidavit. It wasn't just fear or anger, it was something else, something darker. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, something no one had uncovered yet. Just as he was about to voice his thoughts, there was a knock at the door. Marcus's mother frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late, and they weren't expecting anyone. She walked to the door and peered through the peephole, her expression tightening. "It's Evelyn," she said, turning to Marcus. "And she's not alone." Marcus stood up as his mother opened the door. Evelyn stepped inside, her face pale but determined. Behind her was a man Marcus didn't recognize, tall, with sharp features and a serious expression. He introduced himself as Detective Mark Reynolds. "I'm with the Internal Affairs Division," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." Marcus's mother gestured for them to sit, her hands trembling slightly as she poured more tea. Evelyn took a seat across from Marcus, her eyes filled with a mix of urgency and hope. "Marcus," she began, "we've found something. Something big. But it's dangerous. If we're going to move forward, you need to know what you're up against." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Detective Reynolds leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "We've been investigating the judge for a while now," he said, "but what we found goes beyond him. There's a network. People in power who've been manipulating the system for years. They've been covering up crimes, silencing witnesses, and targeting anyone who gets in their way. The judge was just one piece of the puzzle." Marcus's mind was reeling. A network? How far did this go? And why were they telling him this? "What does this have to do with me?" he asked, his voice shaking. Evelyn reached across the table and took his hand. "Because you're at the center of it now," she said. "Your case exposed the judge, and that's made you a target. They're not going to let this go quietly. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves." Marcus felt like the walls were closing in. He had thought the fight was about clearing his name, about standing up to one corrupt judge. But this was something else entirely. This was bigger than him, bigger than anyone in this room. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Detective Reynolds exchanged a glance with Evelyn before answering. "We fight back," he said. "But we have to be smart about it. We need evidence, solid, irrefutable evidence to bring them down. And we need people who are willing to stand up and speak out, even when it's dangerous." Marcus's mother, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "You're talking about putting my son in danger," she said, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "He's just a kid. He shouldn't have to carry this burden." Evelyn nodded, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I know," she said. "And if there was any other way, we'd take it. But Marcus is already in this. They've already targeted him. The only way out is through." Marcus looked at his mother, then at Evelyn and Detective Reynolds. He thought about everything he had been through, the humiliation in the courtroom, the fear, the uncertainty. But he also thought about the people who had stood by him, who had fought for him when no one else would. He thought about Evelyn's son Jamal and all the others who had been wronged by this system. He couldn't let their stories be forgotten. "I'll do it," he said, his voice stronger now. "Whatever it takes, I'll fight." Evelyn squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "But you need to understand, this isn't going to be easy. They'll come after you. They'll try to intimidate you, to silence you. You'll need to be careful." Detective Reynolds nodded. "We'll do everything we can to protect you," he said. "But you have to trust us, and you have to be ready for what's coming." Marcus took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. As the meeting wrapped up and Evelyn and Detective Reynolds left, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his mind racing. His mother sat down beside him, her face filled with worry. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice soft. Marcus nodded. "I have to be," he said, "for Jamal, for everyone like him, for me." But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still to come. The truth was out there, but so were the people who would do anything to keep it buried. And as he closed his eyes, he knew one thing for sure: the fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The days following the meeting with Detective Reynolds and Evelyn were a whirlwind. Marcus felt like he was living in a fog, every moment filled with tension and uncertainty. He had agreed to help, to stand up and fight, but the reality of what that meant was starting to sink in. He couldn't go anywhere without looking over. His shoulder couldn't sleep without wondering if someone was watching him. His mother was a constant presence, her worry etched into every line of her face, but she never tried to talk him out of it. She knew, just as he did, that this was bigger than any of them. The investigation moved quickly. Detective Reynolds and his team worked tirelessly, following every lead, every thread of the tangled web they had uncovered. Marcus was called in to give statements, to recount everything he knew about the judge and the case. It was exhausting, but he pushed through, driven by the thought of what was at stake. Evelyn was always there, a steadying force, her quiet strength reminding him why they were doing this. Then, one evening, Detective Reynolds called an urgent meeting. Marcus, his mother, Evelyn, and Mr. Thompson gathered in a small, dimly lit room at the police station. The air was thick with anticipation, everyone sensing that something big was about to happen. Detective Reynolds stood at the front of the room, his face grim but determined. "We've got them," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "We've got enough evidence to bring down the entire network, but we need to move fast. They know we're closing in and they're getting desperate." Marcus felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly tempered by the look on Detective Reynolds' face. "There's something else," the detective continued. "We've uncovered a connection to someone higher up, someone we didn't expect. It's the district attorney. He's been pulling the strings this whole time." The room erupted into gasps and murmurs. The district attorney? Marcus felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. This wasn't just about a corrupt judge anymore. This was about the very people who were supposed to uphold the law. It was a betrayal so deep it was hard to comprehend. Detective Reynolds held up a hand, silencing the room. "We're going to make our move tomorrow," he said. "But it's going to be dangerous. They'll do anything to protect themselves, and that includes coming after anyone who stands in their way." "Marcus," he said, turning to him, "you're a key part of this. Your testimony could be the final piece we need to bring them down. But it also makes you a target. You need to be ready." Marcus nodded, his heart pounding. He didn't know if he was ready, but he knew he didn't have a choice. This was it, the moment everything had been leading up to. He looked at his mother, who was crying quietly, and at Evelyn, who gave him a small, encouraging smile. He thought about Jamal, about all the others who had been wronged by this system. He couldn't let them down. The next morning, they gathered at the courthouse. The atmosphere was electric, the air thick with tension. Reporters were everywhere, cameras flashing, microphones thrust into faces. Marcus walked in with his mother and Mr. Thompson, his head held high despite the fear gnawing at him. Inside, the courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every eye fixed on the front of the room. The new judge, a stern but fair-looking woman, took her seat, and the proceedings began. Detective Reynolds took the stand first, laying out the evidence in meticulous detail. He spoke of the network of corruption, of the judge's role in it, and of the district attorney's involvement. The room was silent, everyone hanging on his every word. Then it was Marcus's turn. He took the stand, his hands trembling as he swore to tell the truth. He looked out at the sea of faces, at his mother, at Evelyn, at Mr. Thompson, and took a deep breath. Then he began to speak. He told his story, every detail, every moment of fear and humiliation. He spoke of the judge's bias, of the way he had been treated, of the system that had failed him. And as he spoke, he felt something shift in the room. People were listening, really listening. When he finished, there was a moment of silence, then a burst of applause. The judge had to call for order, but the message was clear. Marcus had been heard. The district attorney was called to the stand next. He tried to deny everything, to twist the facts, but the evidence was too strong. Detective Reynolds had done his job well. One by one, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place until there was no doubt left. The judge was removed from the bench, the district attorney was arrested, and the network of corruption began to crumble. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus felt a mix of emotions. relief, exhaustion, but also a strange sense of hope. It wasn't over, not completely, but they had taken a huge step forward. He looked at his mother, who was crying tears of relief, and at Evelyn, who gave him a small, sad smile. "You did it," she said. "You stood up and you made a difference." But just as they were about to leave, Detective Reynolds approached them, his face serious. "There's one more thing," he said. "We found something in the district attorney's files. Something about your father, Marcus." Marcus froze. His father had left when he was just a baby, and he had never known much about him. "What about him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Detective Reynolds hesitated, then handed him a file. "He wasn't who you thought he was," he said. "He was part of this too, but he tried to expose it and they silenced him. That's why he disappeared." Marcus felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him again. His father? Part of this? He opened the file, his hands trembling, and began to read. The truth was there in black and white, and it was more shocking than anything he could have imagined. As he stood there, the weight of it all pressing down on him, he realized that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over. Not for him, not for Evelyn, not for anyone who had been wronged by this system. But for the first time, he felt like they had a chance. And that was enough. The story doesn't end here. It's just the start of a new chapter, one where the truth, no matter how painful, sets the stage for real change. And Marcus? He's ready to face it, one step at a time. The days that followed the courtroom revelations were a blur for Marcus. The news of the district attorney's arrest and the exposure of the corruption network dominated headlines, sparking outrage and calls for reform across the city. Marcus found himself at the center of it all, his name synonymous with courage and justice. But for him, the victory felt bittersweet. The truth about his father weighed heavily on his mind, a piece of the puzzle he hadn't seen coming. He spent hours poring over the file Detective Reynolds had given him, trying to make sense of it all. His father hadn't abandoned them. He had been silenced for trying to do the right thing. It was a revelation that changed everything. Marcus's mother took the news hard. She had spent years believing her husband had left them, and the truth was both a relief and a heartbreak. "He was trying to protect us," she said one evening, her voice trembling as she held the file in her hands. "All this time I thought he didn't care. But he did. He cared so much that it cost him everything." Marcus sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, feeling the weight of her grief. They had both lost so much, but now at least they had answers. And with those answers came a sense of closure, a chance to heal. Evelyn, too, found a measure of peace. The exposure of the corruption network meant that her son's case would be reopened. His name cleared posthumously. It wasn't the justice she had hoped for, but it was something. "Jamal would be proud of you," she told Marcus one day, her eyes filled with tears. "You stood up when so many others stayed silent. You gave us hope." Marcus hugged her, feeling the weight of her words. He hadn't set out to be a hero, but if his story could inspire others to fight for change, then it was worth it. The community rallied around Marcus, their support unwavering. Protests and rallies calling for systemic reform became a regular occurrence, with Marcus often asked to speak. At first he was hesitant. Public speaking wasn't exactly his thing, but he quickly found his voice. He spoke about his experiences, about the flaws in the system, and about the importance of standing up for what's right. His words resonated with people, sparking conversations and inspiring action. It was overwhelming at times, but Marcus knew he couldn't stop. Too much was at stake. Mr. Thompson, ever the mentor, was by Marcus's side every step of the way. He helped Marcus navigate the media attention, offering guidance and support. "You've got a gift," he told Marcus one day after a particularly powerful speech. "You're not just telling your story. You're giving a voice to everyone who's been silenced. Don't ever underestimate the power of that." Marcus smiled, grateful for the teacher who had believed in him from the start. Without Mr. Thompson, he wasn't sure where he'd be. Detective Reynolds continued his work, dismantling the corruption network piece by piece. The investigation was far from over, but progress was being made. "This is just the beginning," he told Marcus during one of their meetings. "We've taken down some big players, but there's still a lot of work to do. And we're going to need people like you to keep pushing for change." Marcus nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He had come so far, but he knew the fight wasn't over. There were still people out there who needed help, still systems that needed to be challenged. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus began to find a new rhythm. He returned to school, determined to finish his education, but his life had changed, in ways he never could have imagined. He was no longer just a student. He was an advocate, a symbol of hope. It was a lot to balance, but Marcus was determined to make it work. He had seen firsthand what could happen when people came together to fight for justice, and he wasn't about to let that momentum die. One evening, as Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his mother, he found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. "Do you think Dad would be proud of me?" he asked, his voice quiet. His mother reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Oh, Marcus," she said, her eyes filled with love. "He would be so proud, not just of what you've done, but of the person you've become. You've got his courage, his heart, and you're using it to make a difference. That's all any parent could ask for." Marcus felt a lump in his throat, his eyes filling with tears. He had spent so much of his life wondering about his father, wishing he could have known him. But now, in a strange way, he felt closer to him than ever. His father's fight had become his fight, and together, they were making a difference. The story of Marcus and his fight for justice didn't end with the courtroom victory. It was just the beginning of a larger movement, one that would continue to grow and evolve. Marcus knew there would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and fear, but he also knew he wasn't alone. He had his mother, his community, and the memory of his father to guide him. And with that, he felt ready to face whatever came next. As he stood on the steps of the courthouse one final time, looking out at the crowd of supporters who had gathered to celebrate the progress they had made, Marcus felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time he felt like they were on the right path. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a fight, a commitment, a promise, and Marcus was ready to keep that promise, no matter what it took. The story of Marcus and his fight for justice is a reminder that change is possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It's a story of courage, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. And it's a story that isn't over, not for Marcus, and not for anyone who believes in a better, fairer world. The fight continues, and with people like Marcus leading the way, there's hope for a brighter future.